Gentleman from Vermont seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Sanders of Vermont.
Pursuant to the order of the House of Monday, June 12, 2000, the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple bipartisan amendment that is co-sponsored by Mr. Rohrabacher, Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Gutkenecht, Mr. Barrett of Wisconsin, and Mr. Baldacci. When I last introduced a version of this amendment in 1996, it received 180 votes, and I hope we can win tonight with strong bipartisan support. This amendment is supported by Families USA, the National Council of Senior Citizens, and the Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Mr. Chairman, over the years, the taxpayers of this country have contributed billions of dollars to the National Institute of Health for research into new and important drugs. And that research money has paid off. Between 1955 and 92, 92% of drugs approved by the FDA to treat cancer were researched and developed by the NIH. Today, many of the most widely used drugs in this country, dealing with a wide variety of illnesses, were developed through NIH research, and that is very good news. The bad news is that, by and large, these drugs, which were developed at taxpayer expense, were given over to the pharmaceutical industry with no assurance that American consumers would not be charged outrageously high prices. Mr. Speaker, the pharmaceutical companies constitute the most profitable industry in this country. Yet while their profits soar, millions of Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs they desperately need because of the high prices they are forced to pay. In fact, Americans pay by far the highest prices for prescription drugs than the people of any other country on earth. And many of these drugs are manufactured right here in the United States, and their research was done through taxpayer dollars. While there are many reasons for the crisis in prescription drugs in this country today, in this amendment I want to focus on one small part of that problem, and that is that it is totally unacceptable for the taxpayers of this country to provide billions of dollars through the NIH in research money for the pharmaceutical industry and get nothing in return in terms of lower prices for the products they help to develop. Mr. Chairman, the reality is that taxpayers spend billions of dollars for research and development of prescription drugs, and they deserve to get a return on that investment in terms of lower prices. Some examples: tamoxifen, a widely prescribed drug for breast cancer, was sponsored, received federally funded research, and NIH sponsored 140 clinical trials to test its efficacy. And yet today, the pharmaceutical industry charges women in this country 10 times more than they charge women in Canada for a drug widely developed with U.S. taxpayer support. Many, many other drugs were developed with NIH support. Zovirax, AZT, the primary AIDS drug, Capitan, Platinol, Prozac, the blockbuster antidepressant, was made possible by the basic NIH-funded research that discovered the brain chemical triggering depression. And on it goes. The reality is, and the New York Times in a front-page story made this point, that much of the drug research in this country comes from taxpayer support. Our amendment requires that the NIH abide by current law and ensure that a company that receives federally owned research or a federally owned drug provide that product to the American public on reasonable terms. This is not a new issue. During the Bush administration, the NIH insisted that cooperative research agreements contain, quote, a reasonable price clause, end quote, that would protect consumers from exorbitant prices of products developed from federally funded research. The NIH several years ago abandoned the clause under heavy pressure from the pharmaceutical industry. While a reasonable pricing clause is not the only device that will protect the investment that American taxpayers have made in numerous profitable drugs, this amendment makes clear that Congress will not stand by while NIH turns over valuable research without some evaluation that the price charged to consumers will be reasonable as is required by current law. I reserve the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman yield?
You have your time. I reserved
Well, I need to know what amendment you're offering, because the amendment we have talks about licensing, and you've just talked about reasonable pricing, and I don't know which one you're offering.
Now, this amendment, Mr. Chairman, is very, very clear. Am I on your time or my own?
Well, you're still on yours at the moment.
Well, I would, why don't you take your own, if you would.
Does the gentleman from Illinois claim the time in opposition?
I do.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, let me first say, let me yield to myself as much time as I may consume. Let me first say a few things. First, this amendment has gone through about 4 different iterations, and we're not quite sure which one you're offering. I have the one in front of me dealing with licensing. We believe that's the one that you...
Yes, that is correct, sir.
That's the correct one. All right. Well, first of all, I understand the point the gentleman's trying to make. I think the amendment misses the mark. First of all, let me say that we have this wonderful synergy in our country where a great deal of the basic research, which provides the foundation for applied research, is done through NIH grants. And we build this body of knowledge, and then our pharmaceutical industry and our biotech industry build on that knowledge to develop products that they take to market. I think that is a wonderful system that does more to develop the kinds of drugs that help eliminate disease or prevent it than any other place in the world. But what the gentleman's amendment attempts to do, and if I can read it, I would read it this way. It says, none of the funds made available in this act for the National Institutes of Health may be used to grant an exclusive or partially exclusive license pursuant to, et cetera, dealing with the licensing of drugs. NIH, the funds that they make for grants are never involved in licensing operations. The licensing is done by the institution subsequent to the completion of the grant. So that while the gentleman, if this amendment passed, might think he's accomplishing something, I believe that the amendment as written would not hit the mark he's trying to hit. And I think under those circumstances that the gentleman, I know how hard it is to fashion an amendment that's in order on this subject under this bill, but this is really an authorizing matter that the gentleman really ought to address in an authorizing forum and not on an appropriation bill.
Will my friend yield?
I will yield.
Okay. I thank you for your thoughts, but I respectfully disagree. And here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that as a result of taxpayer-funded support, very important and wonderful drugs are developed. But the problem, Mr. Chairman, is that millions of Americans who paid for the research to develop those drugs cannot afford the product. And I think it is totally responsible for the United States government to say to the private companies, we are giving you important research, but in return, you have to make some guarantees to the public that you're going to serve the public interest in terms of controlling the prices that you charge. And I think that is something that the taxpayers of this country deserve.
Reclaiming my time, I understand that that's what the gentleman is trying to do. My point is that this amendment doesn't do that. That it deals with the granting of licenses, the grant funds for licensing, and grant funds aren't used for licensing. And so the amendment will be ineffectual to achieve the ends that the gentleman is seeking to attain, in my judgment. And where this whole discussion belongs is not on an appropriation bill, but on an authorizing bill where that subject is in order.
Reclaiming my time.
The gentleman from...
It's my time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were
But
finished.
I'll yield to you.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I would yield to you. You have additional time?
The gentleman from Vermont has 30 seconds remaining.
How much
The gentleman
time?
from Illinois has the right to close and has 1 minute remaining. The gentleman from Vermont.
If I may ask for unanimous consent for an additional minute and yield, would that be okay? And yield a minute to my friend from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Chair would entertain a request to grant 1 minute to each side. Is there objection? Without objection, the gentleman from Vermont.
I'd be happy to yield now a 1 minute to my friend from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
I rise in strong support of this amendment, and let me say that Mr. Sanders has been trying to propose an amendment of this purpose for several years now, but it seems that every time he proposes it, there's just something wrong with it that just isn't exactly right. Well, I don't know about these details about the little loopholes and intricacies of the writing of the bill, but I do know that the fundamental principle he's trying to advocate here is right. And that is, if a pharmaceutical company takes money from the taxpayers to develop a new drug, they have taken on the taxpayers as a partner, and thus they cannot then turn around and exploit the taxpayers and soak them for all the money they can get out of them, because the taxpayers have paid for their basically their research and development. Research and development is the risk that a company takes. And if we are going to pay for that risk, the taxpayers should get something back in return. And fair prices that are affordable prices is certainly a reasonable assumption for companies that are taking that money. By the way, let me note, many pharmaceutical companies don't take research and development money, and they should have every right to charge what they want for their product. But in this case, the principle is absolutely sound, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, a capitalist or a socialist. The fact is, the people have paid a certain amount of money. They deserve some rights with that money.
Gentleman's
and
time
protect
has
the consumer at
expired.
the same time. Yield back the balance of my
The
time.
gentleman from Vermont has 30 seconds remaining.
I think Mr. Rohrabacher hit it right on the head. And that is at a time when millions of Americans cannot afford the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. They need to know that when their tax dollars went to develop these drugs, that the United States government is saying to the private drug company, you cannot charge anything you want, that we are going to, through the NIH, going to negotiate with you for reasonable prices. This is nothing more than asking a fair return for the taxpayers of this country on their investment. Thank you.
Gentleman's time is